They said I was overreacting, but when your mom says it's just a small wedding and forgets to mention you're not invited, what would you do? I packed my life into one suitcase and vanished to Finland. While they danced to love songs, I watched the aurora paint the sky. And then came the news, the vows, the lies, the explosion. And me. I stayed quiet. My silence did the rest. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. It was one of those hot Boston afternoons when the air felt like soup and the mosquitoes refused to take a break. Aunt Carol's backyard smelled like charcoal and sweet corn. A typical July gathering, folding chairs on patchy grass country music humming from a Bluetooth speaker, beer bottles sweating on the picnic table. I showed up an hour late carrying a store-bought pie and a smile I had to rehearse in the car mirror. I hadn't planned on staying long. The past week had already been brutal. My biggest client had pulled out of a renovation project 2 days before signing, and my savings were running thin. Still showing up felt easier than explaining why I hadn't. That's what being part of the Bennett family meant. Appearances first, feelings later. Mom was at the center of it all, as always. Margaret Bennett, 60 years old and polished enough to look like she'd stepped out of a garden party catalog. Her hair was perfect, her pearl earrings catching the sunlight as she laughed too loudly at something Uncle Robert said. My younger sister Lena was across the yard surrounded by her friends. Same effortless energy she'd always had. Her blonde hair caught the light, and when she raised her hand to wave at someone, I noticed a diamond glint. I tried not to react. Maybe it was an anniversary ring or something she'd bought herself. My mother would have mentioned if Lena were engaged. She mentioned everything. I poured myself lemonade and stood near the cooler pretending to be fascinated by a tray of coleslaw. That's when Aunt Carol appeared beside me balancing a plate of cake. She smiled the way relatives do when they're about to say something that's none of their business, so she said cheerfully, brushing crumbs from her shirt, "Have you picked out a dress for the wedding yet?" My hand froze around the paper plate. The what? She blinked, confused by my tone. Lena's wedding. It's next month, right? Your mom said it's going to be small but lovely. For a second, everything around me seemed to blur. The chatter, the music, the clinking of beer bottles. I managed a smile. "Oh," I said lightly. "That wedding." Aunt Carol tilted her head. "Wait, you didn't know?" Before I could answer, Mom called across the yard. "Carol, could you bring the cake knife?" Carol waved and scurried off, leaving me alone with the thud of my heartbeat in my ears. I looked toward the patio. Mom was still talking animatedly, her hand resting on Lena's shoulder. Lena was laughing, showing off the ring to a group of cousins I hadn't seen in years. No one looked in my direction. I forced myself to stay a few more minutes. Someone asked if I wanted another drink. I shook my head and said I had to get back to work. Big project. I lied. "Of course you do." One of the cousins said with that gentle mockery people save for adults who haven't quite met expectations. The drive home was silent. I didn't turn on the radio. When I parked in front of my apartment building, I just sat there, engine idling air conditioner blasting against my face. My fingers itched to call my mother to ask why, but I already knew the tone she'd use. Warm, dismissive, perfectly rehearsed. "Oh, honey, it's just a small one. We didn't want to bother you." Instead, I unlocked my phone and opened messages. Nothing from her. Then I opened Instagram. There it was. Lena Bennett tagged in a post from 2 weeks ago, her in a lace dress holding a bouquet trying out hairstyles. The caption read, "Can't wait for August." 120 likes. Mom had commented 3 red hearts. I searched the family group chat. Bennett family. Official. Not me. I scrolled through the photos, visible from the outside. Mom's chicken recipe, Carol's birthday invitation, a selfie of Lena trying on shoes. My name wasn't on the list. It hadn't been for a long time, I realized. I leaned back in the seat, staring at my reflection in the windshield. The sun had begun to dip, turning everything the color of honey. The faint sound of laughter from a nearby house drifted through the air. No one meant to hurt me. They never did. They just found it easier to forget the one who didn't fit. I turned the key, the engine hummed again. As I looked in the rearview mirror, I caught sight of my mother across the yard. still laughing, her hand resting proudly on Lena's arm. The perfect family tableau framed by sunlight and paper lanterns, not one of them turned around. I shifted into drive and pulled away, the laughter fading behind me, leaving only the sound of my own breath filling the car. The apartment was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you start hearing things, pipes ticking, the hum of the refrigerator, the clock over the kitchen doorway dragging its seconds across the wall. I sat at my drafting table, half-finished floor plans spread out like a broken puzzle, pencil marks from a job that no longer existed. The sunlight through the blinds cut sharp lines across the blueprints, neat little divisions, something my mother would have appreciated. The phone lay next to my coffee mug, screen dark. I kept staring at it like the longer I waited, the more sense this would make. It didn't. After 10 minutes of pretending to read an email, I gave in and called her. "Hi, Mom," I said when she answered. My voice already sounded small. "Claire, honey, how are you?" "I was just thinking of you," she said in that efficient warmth she reserved for store clerks and church fundraisers. I swallowed. I just found out about Lena's wedding. There was the faintest pause, a shuffle of dishes in the background, like she was cleaning something. "Oh, that," she said finally in the same tone she might use for a change in weather. "It's just a small one, sweetheart. We didn't think you'd want the hassle of travel. You're always busy." "Busy," I repeated. I looked around my apartment. 3 empty coffee cups, an unpaid bill. A plant. I'd forgotten to water. Small enough not to mention. "Don't be dramatic, Claire." Her voice softened in that way she used when she was done discussing something. "You know how Lena is. She wants to keep things simple. No fuss, no big crowd." "Mom," I said quietly. "I'm her sister. That's exactly why you should understand. She needs a calm day without pressure." I could hear my own breath through the receiver, steady but hard. If peace means pretending I don't exist, then I guess she'll have the calmest wedding in America. "Now that's unfair," Mom said, sharper this time. "You're reading too much into it. You've always been sensitive about these things. Sensitive. That word again. It had followed me since childhood like lint I couldn't shake off. Sensitive when I cried at Dad's funeral. Sensitive when I refused to laugh at Mom's jokes about Lena's messes. Sensitive when I asked for space and she called it attitude. I said, "You know it's impressive how you can forget someone without even realizing it." "Claire, please don't twist this into something ugly," she said. "Lena's under a lot of pressure. Jason's parents are paying for most of it. There were only so many invitations and I didn't make the cut I finished for her." Silence. Then she sighed, that long, controlled exhale she used when the conversation had run its course. "You know I love you, right? I know you say that." I said, "But I'm not sure you hear yourself anymore." Another pause. I imagined her wiping the counter with a dish towel, smiling politely, even when no one could see. Finally, she said, "We'll talk later, okay? I've got to go. Your aunt's stopping by." "Sure," I said. Wouldn't want to keep anyone waiting. The line went dead. I set the phone down and stared at it, half expecting it to ring again. It didn't. Instead, the clock kept ticking. The air conditioner droned, and somewhere outside a dog barked twice, then gave up. I got up, walked to the kitchen window, and looked down at the street. The world kept moving. Kids riding scooters. A man walking his golden retriever, a delivery van, double parked. Life indifferent as ever. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed, breathing slow. "Don't make it a big deal," she'd said. As if that phrase could shrink 30 years of being half noticed. I'd spent my childhood learning how to disappear without slamming the door. They called it maturity. A soft ping broke the silence. Text message. I didn't need to check to know who it was. "Don't be mad," the message read. "I just didn't want things to get complicated. Love you." Lena. Complicated. I laughed out loud, sharp and humorless. The word looked ridiculous on the screen, like a paper cut pretending to be a wound. I deleted it. No reply, no trace. The phone screen went black again, and for a second I saw my reflection. Eyes, tired, hair undone, a woman who kept waiting for someone to realize she'd been left out of her own story. I turned off the overhead light and sat at my drafting table. The lamp on the corner cast a soft circle across the sketches, the same warm hue as the light from my father's old workshop years ago. Beside it, an old photo leaned against a jar of pens. Dad and me at Lake Winnipesaukee, standing on frozen water, our cheeks red from the cold. He'd written on the back, "Someday we'll see the northern lights. I traced the edge of the photo with my thumb. Someday, I whispered. Outside, the night deepened and the city hummed its low, indifferent song. The lamp buzzed faintly. Steady patient, somewhere between that light and the memory of my father's voice, I found a strange kind of stillness, and for the first time that day, I didn't feel angry, just small. Quietly, perfectly small. The rain started sometime after midnight, soft at first, then steady, a quiet percussion against the windows. I sat on the edge of the couch phone, still in my hand, staring at nothing. The lamp in the corner buzzed faintly, the kind of sound you only notice when everything else has stopped. I stood up and walked to the closet. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust. My passport was in the top drawer of the nightstand under a pile of old receipts. The photo on the cover was already faded at the edges. 10 years, 3 expired dreams. I reached for the gray wool coat hanging in the back, the one I hadn't worn since Dad's funeral. It still carried a faint trace of his aftershave wood and smoke and winter. On the coffee table, a framed photo leaned against a candle jar, Dad and me on the frozen lake in New Hampshire. I was 12, bundled in a red jacket, his arms slung around my shoulder, both of us grinning through the cold. He'd told me about Lapland that day, about reindeer and northern lights. It's a place where everything is quiet, he'd said, but nothing's dead. Even the silence breathes there. He'd meant it as poetry. I hadn't understood it then. I sat down, the picture in my hands. "I'll go there someday," I said aloud to no one. "I promise." My laptop was still open on the dining table, a half-finished invoice blinking on the screen. I minimized it, opened a browser, and typed flights to Rovaniemi, Finland. The prices were absurd. I booked it anyway. Departure in 48 hours, return date left blank. The phone buzzed just as the confirmation email came through. Julia. Her face filled the screen when I answered. Frizzy hair glasses askew, the kind of friend who could read your soul from a sigh. "Claire," she said slowly, "why do you look like you're about to commit arson?" "I'm not," I said, "at least not yet." Her brow furrowed. "You're packing, aren't you?" I turned the camera so she could see the open suitcase on the bed. She exhaled, half a laugh, half concern. "Where are you even going, Finland?" "Finland." "Jesus, you couldn't pick something closer like Vermont." "I need to be somewhere that doesn't remind me of anything," I said. Julia frowned. "So you're running away?" "No," I said quietly. "I'm going to the place Dad used to talk about." He said the silence there felt honest. She looked at me for a long time like she was measuring how far gone I already was. "You really think running halfway across the world is going to fix this? No?" I said, "But maybe I'll finally stop trying to." Julia sighed. "You know, normal people get drunk or dye their hair. I don't drink," I said. "And blonde wouldn't suit me." That made her laugh, which was something. "Text me when you land," she said finally. "And Claire. Don't ghost the entire world this time. No promises." After we hung up, I finished packing. A notebook, 2 sweaters, a camera I hadn't used in years. The photo of Dad, my life, fit easily into a carry-on. By morning, the rain had stopped. The streets outside my apartment glistened under the orange streetlights the world scrubbed clean. I called a cab to Logan Airport. The driver was a man in his 50s, heavy Boston accent, talkative in a kind way. "Vacation?" he asked as he loaded my bag. "Something like that," I said. "Good for you," he said. "Everyone's running from something these days. Least you're honest about it." I smiled. "I'm not sure I am." The city slipped by, in pieces. Brick row houses, coffee shops, opening for the day, joggers dodging puddles. The Charles River shimmered silver under the early light. I watched it disappear behind us, and felt something unspool in my chest, a string I didn't know I'd been holding. At the airport, I moved through the motions check-in security gate numbers. Everything smelled of coffee and jet fuel. I watched families juggling luggage, business travelers typing furiously, couples whispering plans over croissants. Everyone had somewhere to go, someone to meet. My phone vibrated again. Mom's name on the screen. I let it ring until it stopped. Then another call. "Lena." I silenced it. I sat near the window staring at the runway. The loudspeaker announced boarding for Helsinki Group 4. I waited until the final call. When I handed the boarding pass to the attendant, she smiled. "First time to Finland." "Yeah," I said. "First time anywhere, really." She nodded, scanning the pass. "It's beautiful up there. Cold, but peaceful. Peaceful." The word landed somewhere deep. The plane was half full. I took the window seat, pressed my forehead against the glass. The sky outside was turning the color of pale steel, streaked with orange. The engines roared to life, a low vibration running through the cabin. As the plane lifted off, Boston unfolded beneath me, a grid of lights, a fading memory. I thought of my mother's voice, soft and distant, of Lena's text still sitting in the trash folder of the photo of Dad in my bag. I wasn't angry anymore, just empty enough to start over. Somewhere below the clouds, the city vanished, and all that was left was the hum of the plane and the soft ache of being untethered. I closed my eyes, letting the hum fill the space where words used to live. I didn't plan to disappear forever. I just needed to see what silence looked like somewhere else. The first thing I noticed was the cold. The kind that doesn't bite, but settles into your bones like it's asking permission to stay. The air outside the terminal was impossibly clean. The sky, a pale gray, stretched over miles of untouched snow. The driver from Apaka Resort held a sign with my name on it and nodded when I waved. The ride took almost half an hour. The landscape blurred by. Dark pines, frozen lakes, cabins half buried in white. Every few miles I saw reindeer grazing near the road, their breath visible in the thin air. I'd seen photos of Lapland before, but none of them prepared me for the silence. It wasn't empty. It was thick, almost alive. When we arrived, the resort looked like something out of a fairy tale. Wooden lodges, glass-roofed igloos glowing faintly from inside smoke, curling from chimneys. The driver carried my bag to the lobby, a warm cabin with stone walls and a faint smell of pine and cinnamon. Behind the counter stood a man in a thick sweater, tall, dark-haired, calm. He smiled. Claire Bennett. Yeah, I said, stamping snow from my boots. I think I'm still partially frozen. He chuckled softly. That's normal. I'm Finn. Welcome to Apoka. He handed me a keycard and pointed toward the window. Your cabin's just down the path, third on the right. You can see the lake from the glass wall. If you need anything, just ask. He spoke with the careful rhythm of someone who didn't talk much, but meant every word. Outside, my boots crunched on the snow. The air shimmered faintly with frost. I found my cabin easily. Its glass walls glowed faint amber against the white. Inside it was small but warm, the kind of warmth that felt earned. A kettle on the counter, a wool blanket folded neatly on the bed. A journal on the desk with the resort's logo stamped in silver. I pressed my hand against the window. Beyond it, the forest stretched endlessly, snow falling in lazy spirals. My breath fogged the glass. For the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel like punishment. I unpacked slowly. A notebook, my father's photo, a sweater. Nothing more. Then I wrote the first line in the resort journal. No calls, no emails, no one asking where I am. Good. Later that afternoon, Finn knocked on the door to check if everything was fine. Do you need help with the fireplace? He asked. I think I can figure it out, I said, crouching beside the logs. He watched for a moment, then stepped in, striking a match with practiced ease. There's a trail behind your cabin. It leads to the lake. It's frozen now, but beautiful. And the sauna. You'll want to try it tonight. Keeps you from turning into ice. I smiled. I'll keep that in mind. He lingered a second, then nodded and left. The sound of the door closing behind him was almost too soft to notice. As the fire caught, I sat back and listened. Every sound here had a purpose. The creak of the logs, the faint whistle of wind against the roof. My own breathing slowing down. Every sound had a limit. And when it stopped, it left something behind. Sosh, stillness. All the noise I'd been carrying from Boston, the disappointment, the humiliation, the phone calls I didn't take, seemed to melt with the snow off my boots. That evening I went to the communal dining hall. It was small, maybe 10 tables, candlelight flickering off glass walls. A few other guests were scattered around, couples, families, 2 men still in ski gear. I chose a seat by the window alone, content with the company of the snow. Then a woman sat down at the next table. She had silver hair tucked under a knit hat, a weathered face that looked like it had smiled often, even through tears. When she caught me glancing, she smiled. "You're American," she said. "Is it that obvious?" She laughed. "You said water with a T. I'm Eleanor." She extended her hand. "Claire." We ended up sharing dessert, some kind of berry pudding with cream, and the conversation slipped into the kind that only happens between strangers who will never have to pretend for each other. "What brings you here?" she asked eventually. Silence. I said, "And maybe distance." She nodded like she understood. "My husband passed last year. I came to remember what quiet sounds like without him." I hesitated. "Does it help?" Eleanor looked out the window, snow still falling. "Sometimes people don't come to Lapland to hide, you know. They come to stop. Stop what?" She smiled faintly, the things that shouldn't keep going. We didn't talk after that. There was nothing left to say. The snow kept falling, the fire crackled, and in the stillness I felt something shift, like grief folding into calm. Later, back in my cabin, I wrote in my notebook, "I don't know if I'm running or stopping, but for once, the quiet doesn't scare me." Outside, the world glowed faint blue. I turned off the lights and lay on the bed, staring through the glass ceiling. The sky shimmered faintly, green at first, then streaks of violet curling above the tree line. The northern lights. I stepped outside in my coat snow, crunching underfoot, the cold biting my skin awake. The lights rippled across the horizon like a slow-moving wave. I reached out instinctively, hand trembling in the cold air, and whispered, "Did I made it?" The wind carried my breath upward, and for a moment I could almost believe he was somewhere in that light, quiet, alive, watching. Morning came slow and pale, the kind of light that didn't fill the room so much as linger around its edges. The world outside my cabin was blue and white and endless. Steam curled from my coffee cup, fogging the glass where my hand had rested a moment before. I took a picture without thinking. Just the cup, the frost, a sliver of sky, and posted it to my Instagram story. No caption. For a long time, I just sat there, watching the steam fade. It was quiet, except for the crackle of the small fireplace and the distant crunch of snow outside. Maybe someone walking to breakfast. 10 minutes later, curiosity got the better of me. I opened the app. The first 3 names on the viewer list were the ones I expected least. Mom. Lena Rachel. A single red heart blinked beside Lena's name. It didn't sting. Not like I thought it would. I smiled faintly. A real smile, the kind that doesn't ask for anyone to see it. "Thanks for still looking," I murmured. "Sometimes your existence is proven by nothing more than a digital heartbeat." My phone buzzed again. "Julia, they know where you are now." Her text read. I typed back, "Good. At least now they have to look." I put the phone face down on the table and wrapped my hands around the mug. The heat soaked into my palms, steady and grounding. The silence here had started to feel less like a void and more like a companion. Steady, patient, never demanding. Later that morning, I pulled on my coat and boots and stepped outside. The air was sharp enough to wake every part of me. The snow had crusted overnight, a thin layer that cracked gently underfoot. I followed a narrow path down toward the frozen lake Finn had mentioned. The trees opened up to a wide expanse of ice sunlight, scattering across it like glass. A figure was working near the edge, breaking the surface, with an axe clearing ice for a small skating area. Finn looked up as I approached, his breath a pale cloud. "Good morning," he said. "You're brave walking out this early." "Couldn't sleep," I said. "Too quiet." He smiled. "Give it a week. You'll start hearing the quiet as music." I watched him work for a while, the rhythm of the axe clean and measured. "You do this every day." "Mostly," he said. "The tourists love to say they skated on a Lapland lake. My job is to make sure they don't fall through it." "Seems important," I said. He looked up again, the corner of his mouth lifting. "We all have our things to keep from breaking." There was something simple and steady in the way he said it. I nodded toward the cabins behind us. "I'm guessing most of your guests don't come here for vacation. Some come to escape," he said. "Some to think." "You may be both." I said. He leaned on the axe handle, studying me for a moment. "You're here alone." I nodded. "And I'll go home that way too." He didn't press further, just nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. The walk back to my cabin was slow. Every sound, the creak of snow, the whistle of wind through the pines, felt magnified as if the world had turned down its volume just for me. When I reached the steps, I looked back once more. Finn was still there, a dark figure against the white cutting careful lines through the ice. That afternoon I wrote again in my notebook. They saw my post. They didn't write back. Maybe that's the point. I'm not waiting for words anymore, just acknowledgement, proof of being seen. By evening, the dining hall was warm and glowing, the smell of soup and bread thick in the air. I spotted Eleanor sitting by the window, a book closed on the table in front of her. She waved me over. "Good timing," she said. "They're serving salmon stew tonight. It's the closest thing to comfort food I've found this far north." I smiled and joined her. We talked about small things first, the weather, the odd habits of other guests. She had a way of talking that felt both soothing and heavy, like every sentence had lived a long time before it reached her mouth. At one point, she looked up from her bowl and said, "You know what I miss most? The noise, the sound of another person brushing their teeth in the next room, the sound of the kettle boiling, and someone else saying it's too hot." I listened. She kept her eyes on the window where snow kept falling endless and slow. "I was married 40 years, she continued. When he died, everyone told me I should fill the silence with something, volunteering travel people, but I came here instead. I figured I'd rather meet the quiet head-on than pretend it's not following me." I hesitated. "Does it help?" "Some days," she said, "but silence doesn't heal you. It just gives you space to stop running." We finished dinner mostly in silence after that. There wasn't anything else that needed to be said. Back in my cabin, I stood by the glass wall, the night sky wide and full of motion. The aurora had returned. Ribbons of green drifting slowly across the black. I turned off the lamp, letting the glow from outside spill into the room. The quiet pressed in, not heavy, but close, like a hand resting lightly on my shoulder. I didn't cry this time. I didn't feel the ache I'd expected, only a kind of watchful calm, as if the sadness had finally exhausted itself. I whispered into the cold air, "Still here." Outside, the lights shifted again, a slow, silent ripple over the world, and somewhere inside me the noise finally began to fade. The sky had turned to velvet by the time I woke up that evening. The air outside the glass walls shimmered faintly blue, and beyond the tree line, the northern lights were already beginning their slow, silent dance. The clock on my phone said 6:42 p.m. in Lapland, 10:42 in the morning in Chicago, the wedding day. I boiled water for tea, the sound soft and deliberate in the stillness. Miles away, my family would be gathering. I could picture it without effort, the hotel ballroom trimmed in white roses, my mother in a navy dress that matched her pearls, Lena glowing at the center of it all. The jazz playlist I'd downloaded the night before began to hum from my phone, Chet Baker low and steady. I sat at the small table by the window, cupping the mug between my hands, and watched the steam rise against the glass. I tried to imagine how it felt for them at that exact moment, the bridal suite hairspray in the air, laughter echoing off the mirror. Mom probably checking the boutonnieres twice. Lena walking down an aisle lined with people who'd known us both since childhood. I wondered if my mother had told anyone where I was, or if she'd said nothing at all, erasing me quietly the way she always did, as if silence were the most polite kind of disappearance. They'd rearranged the seating, I was sure. Maybe a cousin filled the empty chair, maybe no one noticed the gap. The photographer would angle the shots so the table looked whole. My absence would be as invisible as I had been in every family story that mattered. I sipped my tea. It tasted like honey and pine faintly bitter at the end. My phone buzzed with a notification. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Photos were already flooding social media. Lena's white lace gown, the caption #BigDayBennett, glowing beneath a string of emojis. 1,000 likes in under an hour. I scrolled until my thumb started to ache. Every post felt like a broadcast from another world, one I used to belong to. Smiling faces, champagne flutes matching bridesmaids. Everyone pretending this was perfect. I set the phone face down and looked out at the frozen lake. The aurora flared brighter now, sweeping slow ribbons of green across the sky. I lifted my camera, snapped a single picture, my hand around a coffee mug. The northern lights blurred in the background. I uploaded it to my story. No caption. The post hung there like a whisper, quiet, but undeniable. A knock at the door pulled me back. I opened it to find Finn holding a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "The kitchen sent extras," he said. "Figured you might want some." The smell hit me first, warm, earthy, faintly sweet. "Thank you," I said. "You just saved my dinner." He smiled, the lines near his eyes deepening. "You seem peaceful tonight." I laughed softly. That's one word for it. He looked past me to the table with my untouched tea. It's a beautiful night. Most guests are out by the fire waiting for the lights to peak. You don't want to join them. I'm fine here, I said. I can see everything I need to from where I am. He hesitated, then nodded. All right, but don't let the quiet fool you. Up here, people often say they're fine when they're freezing inside. I met his gaze for a moment. I know, I said quietly. I grew up somewhere colder than this. That made him smile again. Small knowing, and then he left the door closing softly behind him. I tore off a piece of bread and ate it still warm, the crust cracking under my fingers. The music faded into something slower, quieter. My reflection in the window looked distant, almost like someone else entirely, a woman watching a life she no longer belonged to. The phone buzzed again. Another wave of photos, comments, congratulations. I ignored them. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't jealous. I was just done, I whispered into the quiet. I don't need them to see me happy. I just need them to know I exist, and that I don't need them for that anymore. The wind picked up outside, shaking the branches near the cabin. Snow drifted across the glass, turning the world into a moving watercolor of white and green. Somewhere far across the ocean, I imagined the moment when the perfect picture would start to fracture. The wrong conversation, a truth spilling out. Maybe someone's voice would rise. Maybe the music would stop. Every family has its breaking point. I'd already lived mine. I poured myself another cup of tea, let it cool between my palms, and watched the aurora shift until it filled the sky completely. The color of silence, I thought. The sound of everything still breathing. Outside, the lights pulsed brighter, almost alive, while somewhere across the world, the first cracks began to form. The light coming through the glass was too bright to be morning. It was the kind of white that erased everything. Edges, shadows, time. I woke to the vibration of my phone on the nightstand, sharp and insistent, as if the world had remembered me all at once. 20 unread messages, missed calls, 3 voicemails. For a few seconds I stared at the screen without touching it. The snow outside looked untouched, the air perfectly still, but inside the phone there was movement. Chaos, waiting behind each notification. I opened Julia's first. It wasn't a text. It was a video. The screen filled with motion, a hotel ballroom, the sound of voices rising and falling, the sharp clatter of glass. The video was shaky, someone filming from behind a table. The band had stopped playing. People were standing, whispering, phones up. Then Rachel appeared. Her voice cracked, wild, unmistakable. She's been sleeping with him the whole time, she screamed. Her bouquet hit the floor petals, scattering like confetti gone wrong. Someone gasped. Someone else shouted for her to calm down. Jason was in the center, ends raised, face white. Lena stood near the cake, mascara streaking down her cheeks, her dress stained with something dark, red wine, maybe blood from a broken glass. Mom was between them, one hand clutching her pearls, the other reaching for Lena. The camera caught Rachel again, her face twisted in rage, not heartbreak. "You think you can build your life on lies," she yelled. "Let's see how that works out." The video ended mid-shout, the sound cutting to silence. I watched it once. Just once. Then I set the phone down on the blanket beside me. For a long time I didn't move. The silence inside the cabin felt almost alive, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. Outside, the snow still fell soft and steady. I used to think silence meant surrender, that quiet people were weak, that I had to defend myself to exist. But watching that video, hearing the noise, and the breaking, and the panic, it hit me. Silence isn't weakness. It's what remains when the noise destroys itself. The phone buzzed again. Julia's name flashed. I answered this time. "Claire," she said without greeting, her voice, half breath, half disbelief. "You've seen it, yeah. It's everywhere. Chicago's talking social media's... God, it's trending. Hashtag big day." Bennett turned into hashtag breakdown Bennett. I almost laughed. Poetic. "Claire," she hesitated. "You okay?" "I am," I said quietly. "More than they are. I think..." She exhaled into the phone. "They're calling me, you know. Your mom, your aunt. They don't know what to do. Then maybe they'll learn something. Do you want me to say where you are?" "No," I said. "Let them wonder for a while." We hung up without goodbyes. When I turned the phone back over, the missed calls were climbing, 23, 40, 80. By the time I set it face down again, it was buzzing non-stop. 136 by the end of the hour. Mom, Lena, Aunt Carol, a few unknown numbers, probably reporters by now. I stood, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a wall. Sharp, clean, real. My breath rose in clouds as I walked toward the edge of the property. Snow creaked beneath my boots, the air full of light. Finn was out near this path, shoveling a layer of fresh snow away from the cabins. He looked up when he saw me. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." He leaned on the shovel, squinting at me through the brightness. Something happened. "Something ended," I said, which is probably the same thing. He nodded slowly, the way people do when they know better than to ask. "You want to talk about it?" I shook my head. No need. It wasn't my story to fix. He studied me a moment longer. "You look calm." "I just learned something," I said. "Sometimes the truth doesn't need anyone to defend it." Finn smiled faintly. "That's rare wisdom. Or maybe just exhaustion," I said. He went back to shoveling, and I walked further out to where the forest met the lake. The ice stretched flat and endless, unbroken, except for a single line where sunlight caught the surface. The phone in my pocket buzzed again, muffled, relentless. I didn't take it out. I let it ring. I breathed in the frozen air, each inhale sharp enough to sting. The sound of the shovel faded behind me until all that remained was the whisper of wind against snow. I tilted my head back and watched the sky. The northern lights were faint now, barely a ripple of color in the morning light. For the first time, I didn't feel like they were a sign or a miracle. They were just light moving through cold air. Brief, beautiful enough. Somewhere across the world, a wedding had imploded, in a family's carefully built image collapsing under its own weight. And here, in the middle of nowhere, I felt lighter than I had in years. The phone stopped vibrating. The silence settled again, complete and still. I turned toward the cabin, my footprints marking the untouched snow, and thought not for the first time how strange it was that peace could arrive disguised as ruin. 3 days passed before I checked my phone again. The snow outside never stopped drifting against the windows until the world looked erased. Inside the cabin smelled of tea leaves and burnt wood. The silence had grown thick, layered like something you could touch. When I finally unlocked the screen, the messages came in waves. "Mom, Lena won't eat. You have to come home. Lena. I need you. Please. Aunt Carol. People are talking. Your mother's beside herself. You know how she gets when things go wrong. There were dozens more. Frantic, repetitive, desperate. None of them said they were sorry. They just wanted the cleanup crew back. They didn't miss me. They missed what I did for them." I put the phone down and poured more hot water into my cup. Outside, the wind swept across the frozen lake with a low, mournful hum, like a song that didn't want to be heard. The phone started buzzing again. This time, a call. Julia. I hesitated before answering. "Hey, Claire," she said, her voice raw. "It's bad. Your mom hasn't slept. Lena won't leave her apartment. People are calling me asking if you've spoken to them." I took a slow sip of tea. "I haven't. Maybe you should," Julia said. "They're unraveling. I already did everything I could, Jules," I said quietly. "By leaving." There was a pause. "You really think silence helps?" "It's the only thing they never tried." Julia exhaled, the sound sharp through the line. "You're colder than Finland right now." "I'm not cold," I said. "I'm just done being the one who fixes everyone else's mess." Neither of us spoke for a while. Then she said softer, "I get it. Just promise you'll answer when I call again. I will." I said, though, I wasn't sure I meant it. After the call, I bundled up and stepped outside. The snow was falling heavier, fat flakes clinging to my coat and lashes. I walked toward the lake, following the same path I'd taken that first day. My footprints from before had vanished. When I reached the clearing, the world was a wash of white and gray horizon barely visible. The lake lay silent, frozen solid, stretching far into the fog. My breath came out in thick clouds. A figure stood near the edge, her suitcase beside her. Eleanor. She was dressed for travel, a red scarf wrapped tight around her neck. When she saw me, she smiled. "I was hoping to say goodbye," she said. "I'm heading south before the next storm hits." I nodded. "You found what you came for." "Not exactly," she said. "But I found out what I didn't need anymore." She looked at me for a long moment. "You're thinking about going back, aren't you?" "I don't know," I admitted. "They keep calling." It's like the worse things get, the louder they get. Eleanor stepped closer, her boots crunching softly in the snow. Don't go back because you feel guilty, she said. Go back only if you want to live, not to save. Her words landed like a stone dropped into water. Quiet, deep, final. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I know, I said. She reached out and squeezed my hand. You remind me of myself, 30 years ago. Don't wait that long to choose yourself. Then she picked up her suitcase and walked toward the waiting van, disappearing into the falling snow. I stood there, long after she was gone, the air biting at my face, the sound of the wind filling the empty spaces inside me. I pulled my gloves off, reached into my pocket, and unfolded a scrap of paper I'd torn from my notebook the night before. On it, in my own handwriting, were the words, "I'm sorry I wasn't enough." I struck a match from the box I kept for the fireplace. The flame flared, tiny and fragile in the wind. I held the paper until it caught, then let it go. It curled instantly black at the edges, rising in the cold air, before breaking apart, small sparks disappearing into the sky. The ashes scattered across the snow carried away before they could land. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like apologizing for that. The wind grew softer, the snow lighter, almost tender. I stayed there breathing it in until the match burned down to my fingertips. Then I turned back toward the cabin, the smoke from my breath fading behind me. The knock came just after midnight, steady but soft enough that I almost thought I'd imagined it. The aurora was out again, casting a dim green glow through the glass ceiling, painting the walls in shifting light. I hesitated, pulling my sweater tighter, then walked to the door. Finn stood there, bundled in a heavy coat, snow dusting his hair and shoulders. His breath fogged the air between us. "Sorry to wake you," he said quietly. "There's someone asking for you at the lodge, an American woman. Says she's your mother." For a second I forgot how to breathe. "Are you sure I asked, though I already knew?" He nodded. "She looks tired. She said she came a long way." I stood there frozen, the cold sneaking through the doorway. Behind Finn, the snow glowed faintly under the northern lights. "Thanks," I said finally. "I'll go." He gave me a small, cautious smile and walked off into the snow. The sound of his boots fading into the wind. I pulled on my coat and gloves, heart hammering against my ribs. By the time I reached the main lodge, my breath was coming fast, each exhale a small cloud. The lobby lights were dim, the fireplace low, and there she was. Margaret Bennett sitting near the hearth hands, wrapped around a mug of tea that had probably gone cold. Her hair was pinned back, stray strands framing her face. She looked smaller than I remembered, the kind of tired that didn't come from travel, but from years of holding everything too tightly. She looked up when she heard me. Her eyes found mine immediately, and for a second, neither of us moved. "Claire," she said finally, her voice breaking on the second syllable. "Mom." She stood, but didn't come closer. We just looked at each other. The mother who'd built her world on appearances and the daughter who'd stopped pretending to belong there. Finn hovered by the counter, pretending to check something on the computer. I gave him a nod. "We'll be outside," I said. We stepped into the snow. The air bit at our faces, the world glowing green and white. The snow reached almost to my knees, soft but heavy. She pulled her coat tighter, her breath trembling. "I didn't think you'd actually come here," I said. "Julia told me, she said. I called her after everything. She said you were safe." "Safe enough," I said. She nodded, her eyes flicking to the sky. "It's beautiful here." "It is." We stood there in silence for a long time, the only sound the wind threading through the trees. Finally, she spoke. "I just wanted to talk, to explain what that I didn't mean for things to get this bad." She paused, voice shaking slightly. "I was just trying to keep the peace, to keep the family together." I looked at her, snow catching in my lashes. "You mean to keep us looking together?" She flinched just barely. "That's not fair. It's exactly fair." My voice came out steadier than I expected. "You've always cared more about how things look than how they feel." "I did what I thought was right," she said, almost pleading. "You don't understand the kind of pressure. People talk. Your aunt, the neighbors." I cut her off. "And I was the price you paid for their approval." She blinked, tears shining in her eyes. "That's not true." "It is," I said. "You chose peace over honesty. Every single time." The wind carried her breath away before she could respond. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the snow shoulders shaking. Finally, she whispered, I just wanted to protect us from what I asked, from being human. Her voice cracked, from being embarrassed. There it was, the truth, small and pathetic and painfully honest. I felt something inside me loosen, not anger, not pity, just release. She looked up at me again, tears streaking down her cheeks, freezing almost instantly. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I should have invited you. I just didn't want another fight." I nodded slowly. "You didn't need to invite me to a wedding, Mom. You just needed to let me belong somewhere." She reached out then, hesitating before her hand touched my arm. "I don't know how to fix this. You don't? You just stop pretending it's not broken." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The sky above us rippled with green light, washing her face in color. We stood there like two statues carved out of the same cold, frozen in different ways, but shaped by the same storm. She wiped her eyes, her breath coming out uneven. "You're stronger than me," she said softly. "You always were." I almost smiled. "That's not strength. It's survival." Her lips trembled. "Will you ever come home?" I looked up at the sky, at the endless sweep of light moving over us. "Maybe I already did," I said. She didn't understand what I meant, but she didn't argue. She just stood there beside me, both of us breathing in the same frozen air. The silence between us wasn't peaceful, but it wasn't cruel either. It was real, and for the first time in our lives that felt like enough. The aurora stretched higher, spilling green fire across the clouds, and our shadows lengthened on the snow, two figures standing still under a sky that refused to stop moving. The morning came gray and quiet, the kind of light that had no beginning. Snow pressed heavy against the windows, muffling everything. I woke later than usual, my body sore from the cold and from the conversation that had scraped the night raw. The fire had burned out, leaving only a faint warmth under the blanket. I made coffee black and bitter and sat at the wooden table near the window. The sky outside was a single shade of pale gray. No horizon, no sun, just stillness. I pulled my notebook closer, tore out a clean page and stared at it until my breath fogged the air. Then I began to write. "I hope you find peace, Mom. I hope Lena learns to be honest, with herself first before anyone else. I hope next time the invitation comes before the apology." The words came slowly, but they didn't shake. They were plain, unadorned enough. When I finished, I read it once more, then folded the page neatly, the crease sharp as memory. I slid it into an envelope, wrote the old address in Boston, in small, careful letters. The handwriting looked like someone else's, steadier, older. I didn't add a return address. I sealed it, pressed my thumb against the flap, and held it for a moment before setting it down beside my coffee mug. I wasn't writing to be read. I was writing to let go. Outside, the snow had thickened, turning the world into a blur of white. I layered on my coat and scarf, pulled on gloves stiff from the cold, and stepped outside. The air bit my face sharp and clean. Each step sank deep snow reaching the tops of my boots. The path to the village was narrow and quiet. The forest looked like something carved from glass, every branch dipped in ice. My breath puffed into small clouds, the only sign that anything was alive. The town itself was barely more than a cluster of wooden buildings, and a single shop with a flickering sign. The red postbox stood out against the pale snow, its paint chipped but bright. I stopped in front of it and hesitated. The envelope felt light in my hand, almost weightless. A man stepped out of the small shop nearby, wiping his hands on a towel. He was older, maybe 70, with a white beard and eyes that looked like they'd seen every winter there was to see. He smiled when he noticed me. "Cold day for a walk," he said, in accented English. I smiled back. "Not as cold as it used to be." He chuckled, softly, nodded toward the envelope. "Sending something home. Something like that?" I said. He nodded once, as if that was answer enough, and went back inside. The door creaked shut behind him, the sound swallowed by the snow. I turned back to the postbox. My hand hovered over the slot for a moment. Then I slipped the letter through. It made a small sound as it landed inside, final and soft, like an exhale. For a moment I stood there staring at it, feeling the wind pick up around me. The snow swirled in slow spirals, tiny flakes catching the light. It struck me how strange closure looked, not grand or loud, but simple. A letter no one would ever read, a silence that finally felt earned. I stayed there longer than I needed to, watching as the wind layered fresh snow over the box, softening its edges, erasing my footprints one by one. When the flakes grew heavier, I turned back toward the path. The man inside the shop was humming something, low, rhythmic, familiar. It sounded like an old hymn one my father used to hum when he was fixing things around the house. I followed the sound in my mind as I walked until it faded behind me, replaced by the steady rhythm of my own boots breaking through the snow. By the time I reached the cabin, the light was beginning to dim again. I brushed the snow from my coat, hung it by the door, and sat down by the window. The letter was gone somewhere between worlds, carrying pieces of a life I no longer needed to hold. Outside, the wind quieted. The sky shifted from gray to a faint blue, and for a moment a soft shimmer appeared on the horizon. The beginning of the lights, pale and uncertain, just like forgiveness. A week slipped by quietly, the days bleeding into one another like ink spreading through water. The storms had passed, leaving behind skies so pale they looked transparent. I started spending my mornings in the little cafe by the resort entrance, a wooden building that always smelled of cinnamon and roasted beans. The owner played soft music, old jazz mixed with Finnish folk songs. It felt like the kind of place where time forgot to hurry. I sat by the window, notebook, open pen hovering above the page. The last few entries were short, half sentences, half thoughts. I didn't need to write everything anymore. Some feelings had already burned themselves out. Finn brought over my coffee, the mug steaming in the cold light. "You've become a regular," he said, setting it down. "I guess that means I've stopped running," I said. He nodded, sliding into the chair across from me. "You're leaving soon." "Tomorrow," I said. "Flight to Helsinki, then back to the States." He smiled faintly. "Back to what you ran from?" "Not exactly. I think I'm going back to something new." He studied me, his expression thoughtful. "You'll miss the quiet." "I will," I said. "But I think I'm finally ready to carry it with me." He sipped his coffee, then leaned back, eyes on the window where the morning sun hit the snow. "You seem lighter," he said, "like someone who's just finished a war." I laughed quietly. "Maybe I did." Finn tilted his head. "Did you win?" I looked down at my notebook, at the messy pages filled with anger and heartbreak and long silences. "Winning wasn't the point," I said. "It was surviving it without becoming them." He smiled, slow and genuine. "Then maybe that's what peace looks like." After he left, I sat there for a while, watching people come and go, couples wrapped in scarves, families heading out for sled rides. The world kept moving, indifferent but gentle. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, breaking the rhythm. It was an email from Julia. The subject line: "Thought you'd want to know." I opened it. The news finally broke, she wrote. Jason Reed was fired after the wedding video leaked. Some investor pulled out of his company. Lena left Chicago. Your mom's keeping her distance from everyone. No one's talking about the wedding anymore. I read it twice, not out of shock, but to let the words settle. No one's talking about the wedding anymore. I smiled faintly, tracing the rim of my coffee cup. "Good," I murmured. Silence finally learned its manners. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Julia. "I hope you're okay. You don't have to come home yet. Just come back when it feels like you can breathe there again." I typed back a short reply, "I already can." Then I put the phone away and closed my notebook. I turned to the last blank page, the one I'd been saving without realizing why. I wrote slowly, pressing each letter into the paper, as if sealing it there. I chose peace. That was all. I closed the book and set it beside the coffee mug. Outside, the morning light spilled across the snow, pale gold now, instead of gray. The northern lights were gone, but the sky still shimmered faintly, a trace of color that refused to fade completely. I pressed my palm against the window, feeling the chill seep through the glass. The surface fogged beneath my hand, soft and temporary, then cleared again. The world outside looked endless, but for the first time, I didn't feel lost in it. Peace wasn't loud. It didn't arrive like thunder or victory. It came in small, ordinary ways. A letter mailed without a return address. A cup of coffee gone cold, a day that didn't ask for anything. I sat there until the light shifted, until the air turned the color of quiet gold. Then I whispered to no one in particular, "That's enough." And for once, it truly was. Boston was softer than I remembered. February had traded its gray for something gentler. Puddles where snow used to be bare branches trembling under a shy sun. The city didn't look like it had forgiven winter, but it was learning how to move on. So was I. I stepped out of the cab with my single suitcase and the worn leather notebook tucked under my arm. The street was quiet except for the sound of melting ice dripping from the eaves. The air smelled faintly of salt and something green just starting to live again. My mother's house looked the same. White shutters, uneven brick steps, the porch light that never quite stopped flickering. I hesitated at the gate, my hand on the latch, remembering all the times I'd walked through that door, pretending everything was fine. The curtains in the front window were drawn. There was no sound inside, no movement. I climbed the steps slowly, the wood creaking under my boots. On the top step, just beneath the doormat, lay a letter. The envelope was thin, her handwriting instantly familiar, steady, looping, careful, Claire in blue ink. Nothing else. I picked it up, holding it in both hands. The paper was warm from the sunlight. For a long moment, I stood there, unsure if I wanted to know what was inside. Then I noticed the faint indent of another line beneath my name, written smaller like an afterthought. Your mother is learning how to be quiet, I smiled. A small, tired, real smile. I didn't open the envelope. Some words didn't need to be read to be understood. I placed my palm flat against the wooden door, the same one I used to slam when I was 17. The same one that had stayed closed for too long. Goodbye, I whispered. Not angry, not sad. Just final. Then I turned and walked away. The afternoon light had shifted by the time I reached the corner. A tram bell rang faintly in the distance, echoing off the buildings. I followed the sound until I reached the cafe where Julia and I used to meet after work. Still there, same chipped awning, same smell of espresso and rain. Inside, the air was warm and thick with conversation. I ordered a coffee and found a seat near the window. The world outside glistened. Melting snow running in narrow streams down the sidewalk. The kind of ordinary beauty you only notice when you stop waiting for something bigger. My phone buzzed. Julia's name lit up the screen. Hey, I said when I answered. Hey, stranger, she said. You're really back. Just got in. Home already. I looked out at the street. The familiar buildings, the gray slush, the soft clang of the tram bell. Yeah, I said. I think I am. She paused. You sound different. I am. We talked a little longer about nothing and everything. The weather, work, her new boyfriend. It felt easy again. No guilt, no pretending. Before we hung up, she said, I'm glad you didn't disappear forever. Me too, I said. Turns out forever's overrated. When the call ended, I set the phone on the table and opened my notebook. The last page still read, I chose peace. I ran my finger over the words, then closed it for good. Outside the window, a boy splashed through a puddle laughing. The sound was so simple, it almost hurt. Home isn't where they wait for you. It's where you can finally be still without asking permission. I finished my coffee watching the steam fade into the air. The tram passed again, its bell soft fading toward the river. The city's rhythm felt slower now, easier to match. In my mind, I saw the lake in Finland still frozen under the pale light, the aurora curling faintly across the horizon. The memory came not with ache, but with calm. A photograph that no longer asked to be held. The same quiet filled the space around me, now different but familiar. When the noise stops, you finally hear yourself. 136 missed calls. One life I no longer had to miss. If someone ever writes you out of their story, don't chase the ending. Write it again in your own voice. It doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be true.